Hello and welcome to yet another video, and in this video I have a very exciting lens to share with you guys, and it's this lens right here. It's the RF 100 to 400mm lens. Yes, it's one of the very few non-L lenses that I have, but I actually really enjoy using this lens so much, and it's been very reliable. The quality is really nice, and in this video, just as usual, it's just my thoughts on using this lens based on how I use it for the past almost 2 years. And yeah, without further ado, let's get into the video. So the Canon RF 100 to 400mm lens, this is a very dark aperture lens, and it came out quite a while ago. Well, actually only a couple of years really, but I've been using this lens for quite a while as well. But before I get deeper into the video, I have to kind of give you a little bit of a disclaimer that this lens is not my most often used lens. In fact, I bought this lens purely just for, part of the visual note taking and also more of just like a snapshot lens. So it hasn't really seen any professional shoot, and I haven't really put it into like a more intentional shooting situations either. So most of the shots you'll be seeing in this video is just from like, me traveling and just kind of like taking snapshots here and there or visual notes. And yeah, that's pretty much what I've been using this lens for. That being said, it went through some environments as well, so kind of like semi-harsh environments, not as harsh as like what I put my L lenses through, but it's been through a lot of places as well. So within this video, I'll be dividing this video into 3 different sections as usual. The first one, I'll be talking about the ergonomics and the operational side of things on this lens, and then leading down into the image quality before going directly into the third one, which is my conclusion, why I still recommend this lens, and why it's such a good lens to have. It's much better than you think right now, from what you've been reading through different articles and also what you've been seeing through these spec sheets. So yeah, without further ado, let me first start with the first section, which is the ergonomics and the operational side of things. So this lens is actually, despite its look, it's a very light lens, and the build quality is actually quite good as well. Not far off from some of my other lenses like the 15 to 35mm. Of course, this has weather sealing. This does not have weather sealing, but in terms of the plastic quality, it's not far off, which I think it's a compliment for this lens and not so much for the RF 15 to 35 f2.8, but yeah, that's for a different video. Anyway, it has the metal mount, which is great. So even though it's a budget lens, but it has a metal mount, which is really, really nice. The zoom does zoom externally, and there is a lock that you can actually kind of lock it once the lens is back to its widest focal range, which is at 100mm. So that's great, but you don't really need the lock either because this lens doesn't really creep. So I really like this about this lens, because if you're just setting this lens on the camera and then have the camera set onto a tripod doing like a long exposure somewhere, and the camera would be pointing up slightly for whatever reason, if you want to photograph the stars or photograph from a lower angle at a certain building, things like that, then the lens will not start to creep. Of course, I only have this lens for kind of 1.5 years or almost 2 years, somewhere in between, because I bought it not far off when it was released. So it's still relatively new, so I cannot say if it will remain this quality after 8 years or 10 years. Hope so, but that's only what you can really predict. But from judging from the Canon production quality, how they've been producing even the older EFS and EF lenses, after a while it will not really loosen up. If the lens is designed not to creep, then it will not creep even after 10 years, because I still have some of the EFS lenses and EF lenses that still don't creep after 10 years. So yeah, I have very high expectations for this lens, because even though it was and it is still a budget lens, it's not that cheap either. And especially when I am based in Europe as well, it costs extra due to tax reasons, but still. it's cheap, but not that cheap. Anyway, moving on to the next point, since we're at the locking switch, I would also like to mention about these switches right here. It's not as stiff as lenses like the 15 to 35 millimeter, but it's also stiff enough that you're not going to be accidentally shifting the switches right here. And if you put this lens into like one of the more cramped bags or cramped camera bags, it will also not really start switching accidentally by itself or get knocked around by other equipment into the bag. So that's also quite good. And the lens profile itself is really thin, and up here you have 3 rings, as you know, quite nice, and they're actually quite comfortable as well. The first one I'd like to talk about is the zoom ring right here, which is actually quite nice. It's really huge. It goes beyond the rubberized part as well, so you can actually quite grip it quite nicely even in winter when you're wearing gloves, so that's quite nice. Moving on up is the manual focus ring, which is actually quite nice and smooth. It's very buttery smooth. It is focused by wire, but there is a tiny bit of resistance in there, which is quite nice when working in winter, because you know, sometimes you just need to have that little bit of confirmation if you're really shifting focus ever so slightly. And with this tiny bit of resistance, it does give you a bit more, or at least in my subjective opinion, it does give you that bit more kind of precise focus if you want to do manual focusing. And then up here, which is the control ring, which I rarely use. Actually, I don't use it at all, because I find cameras like the R3, R5, R6, those kind of cameras, they all have more than enough dials on the camera, as well as more than enough customizable buttons on the cameras as well, that I find this control ring useless. It's a nice feature to have, but for how I shoot, it's a very useless feature to have, whether it's on this lens or on my 85 1.2, 50 1.2, 28 to 70 f2, things like that. I find it kind of useless to have, but of course there are friends of mine who really relies on, you know, the control ring quite a bit, and I think Canon also offers the service to declick it as well, although that will be a paid service, so if you're interested. I also have the lens hood, but sadly I cannot find the lens hood, and I don't recommend using the lens hood anyway, because on its own it actually does a very good job of preventing flare anyway, but there is a bit of flaring to this lens, well, this optical quality, but more on that later in the image quality section. Anyway, moving on to the next point, which is, yeah, its overall size and weight. The overall size and weight is actually very nice. I really like it because it's very light, it's very thin, and it's very small. It's actually much lighter, much lighter than my 70 to 200 f2.8 RF, which is, yeah, behind me right there. So a lot of times I am able to just bring this lens around on my holidays alongside my professional cameras. Anyway, well, camera gear. So yeah, it's actually quite nice. But of course, talking about bringing gear around, again, this is not a weather sealed lens, so be very careful when you do use this lens, and especially when you extend the barrel out, you know, because it's not a weather sealed lens. I'm not sure how good this barrel is at preventing dust from getting in, because every time you extend and shorten the focal range back to its widest position, you know, air gets pumped in and sucked out, things like that. So a lot of dust could potentially be going inside the barrel and causing a lot of dust to build up on the rear element over time. So just be careful. Again, I'm not sure how good the sealing is, but because there's no official weather sealing in here, all I can just say is just be careful when using this lens. On to the next point, which is the autofocusing system. The autofocusing system in this lens actually works really nicely and really reliably as well. A lot of times it just gets into the point really well. Even with the RP, I didn't have any problems with, you know, focusing on, you know, the animal's eyes with the 100 to 400 millimeter lens right here. It's just, you know, it's just hit on. And then of course it already starts at aperture 5.6 to f8 at 400 millimeter point, so it's not hard to kind of detect eyes or kind of jump into focus. But again, you know, at 400 millimeter focal range, it still has to travel quite a bit as well just to keep things in focus, because it's a really far reach. Unless if you're used to lenses like 600 millimeters, 800 millimeters, things like that, then, you know, 400 is kind of not such a long distance to really travel through when it comes to focusing. But you know, for me, coming from a lens like the 70-200, a 400mm lens is just, you know, double the focal range. So for me, it's kind of a new experience as well with 400mm, and to me, it's kind of an extreme zoom range as well. So yeah, there is that. But even in low light, this lens doesn't really hunt a lot. Of course, now you're going to be kind of relying on the camera's autofocusing system as well to be able to focus in low light, but generally speaking, it doesn't really hunt. And once it's able to get hold of the subject, it's able to track that subject very well. And if you're photographing birds, the autofocusing system in here is also more than fast enough to just track on certain birds like seagulls, pigeons, eagles as well. So yeah, I'm really impressed by the autofocusing system of this lens as well. And another point is actually the IS. The IS on this lens is really, really nice. And it's also really quiet. So if you're filming with this lens, especially if the mic is external, you will not really capture that unless the room is completely, or if the location you're photographing or filming is completely silent, then you will pick up the IS. But it's definitely very, very quiet in here, and it works really, really nicely. And of course, if you're coming from other lenses with better IS, then I have no benchmark for that. Again, I'm coming from the 70-200 f2.8, and of course the IS on that lens is great. But I'm just saying that since I haven't really gone above 200 before having this lens, being able to have very steady shots at 400 using this lens is really, really impressive, at least in my standards. And I was able to capture a lot of really nice still images just using the IS on this lens at kind of like twilight hours or golden, like after golden hours, so before the sun, after the sun sets, and still having like really good stabilized images from this lens. It's just great without using higher ISOs. So yeah, and now on to the next point, which is into the image quality section. This lens has a, like, I would say above average when it comes to the performance of the optical quality, and you know, like, there are still some softness on the corners, and if you stop it down to like f8, let's say at 100mm focal range, if you stop it down to f8, that's when the corner really improves dramatically. But at f5.6, you still get a pretty decent sharp image. The center will be quite tack sharp, but just the corners will just be still very tack sharp if you don't zoom in. But when you zoom in, that's when you start seeing a little bit of softness at the corners. So overall, it is good, just kind of like above average to good, but yeah, it's not like something you would write home about, you know. But for the price, I would definitely say it's good. Then the contrast control on this lens is really nice, regardless of lighting that you're shooting in. Even in direct sunlight, the contrast is still very nice. Of course, the contrast will be a little bit lower than in, you know, kind of flat daylight when you're shooting in against the sunlight. So just be aware of that. But you know, for the price, it does a very excellent job of controlling the contrast in most lighting situations, and also the sharpness goes the same with that in most lighting condition and in most focal range. So yeah, I think that's something to be really impressed about, especially at this price point, with the sharpness and the overall contrast control. The flaring on this lens, there is definitely flaring, and just like with any Canon lenses of, well, this price range, the flaring control is actually very nice, and when there is flare, it looks very natural and very pleasing. And if you're also into sun star effect, this lens does offer really nice, well, does produce really nice sun star effect as well. The front element also does a good job of actually all of the lens elements really does a good job of rendering the background blur when you are able to get the background blur, of course. So if you're focusing, let's say, on seagulls far away, but then the background is also quite far away as well, then you're able to get really nice smooth out background blur. So yeah, it does a good job of rendering those background blur and rendering details as well, and reproducing colors to the accurate point as well. So I'm really impressed about that. And of course, the There is also the lens distortion as well, but not too extreme. It's very easy to correct it in post and also in camera, so there is that. And now over onto the conclusion. So overall, I think you can kind of hear from the tones already, this lens is a great lens to have in my opinion, based on how I shoot. Simply because it is a very light, very affordable lens to have. The contrast on this lens is really nice, the sharpness of this lens is really nice. Of course, there is that bit of softness around the corners, but it does improve as you stop it down a bit more, and with a more advanced autofocusing system from, you know, the more later mirrorless cameras from Canon, the darker aperture doesn't really matter that much, to be very honest with you. And of course, if you want the super background blur, like, you know, having the f4 or f4.5 or even the f2.8, then you definitely have to spend a bit more, but you still can achieve some sort of like good enough background blur with this lens. And not to mention, this lens at 400 millimeters, the shortest focusing distance is around 1 meter. I was debating whether to say 100 centimeters or 1 meter, and saying 100 meters would actually be a bit weird. But anyway, it's around 1 meter shortest focusing distance, give or take, at 400 millimeters. So that's actually really, really nice, especially if you want to do wildlife shooting and your subject is only like a couple of meters away from you, and you zoom into like 400 millimeters, you will be able to get really nice background blur with that. So yeah, that's really, really nice, and you will be able to, you know, work around the softness of the corners by adding a bit of sharpening, or actually, if you don't crop a lot, well, if you don't zoom into your images a lot, you will not really notice the blur of the, well, not blur, but kind of like the tiny softness of the corners. So yeah, and also if you're doing a lot of shoots that involve having like subjects in the center of the frame, then those soft corners will just add just slightly to the aesthetics and the characteristics of the images as well, in a nice way, of course. So yeah, overall I highly recommend it if you're not planning to get, you know, a 600 or 800 f11 RF, because before this lens came out, I was really looking into the 600 millimeters and the 800 millimeters f11, and I'm glad I didn't pull the trigger on those lenses and waited for this, because this is a much smaller lens. Of course, it's a completely different type of lens, but it does offer more versatility in my opinion, and if I need to crop, I have the R5 to crop, and or just use a crop sensor mirrorless camera to crop in. So yeah, there is that. I hope you find this video a bit useful. If not a lot, then a little. If you need a free photography guidebook, it's absolutely for free for beginners on my website. The link is down in the description section below. If you need a photography guide, well, photography course, it's also on my website. More free courses are coming for sure later on in the year, and more courses are coming up in the very near future for sure, because I just finished shooting several courses here in Thailand. And yeah, otherwise, if you have any questions, any recommendations, anything to share, feel free to also comment down in the comment section below as well. Otherwise, I thank you all very much for watching. Stay safe, have fun shooting. Till next time, bye for now.